All right, Ireland, we're live. Hello, this is Ireland. I feel like here in Europe, when we say these things, we feel like in the Eurovision Song Contest. But this is Dublin, this is Ireland. Can you hear us? Are we live?
Yep, I can hear you and you're live.
Okay, well then it's okay for us to start?
Yes, I'm going to mute my microphone so that I don't disturb you.
Okay. Very good. I'm on. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're taking over the baton from Canada in this very exciting Around the World Symposium on Digital Culture. My name is Jürgen Barkov. I'm the director of the institute that is hosting the next 2 hours of this 24-hour digital online symposium on digital culture. I will only say a few words of welcome, but I want to very, very briefly introduce our institute and our institution. So we are now, the next 2 hours of this symposium will be broadcast from Trinity College in Dublin in the Republic of Ireland. Trinity College is Ireland's oldest and premier university, established in 1592 and perhaps best known for its iconic library, the Long Room, here on the historic campus in the middle of the city. The Trinity Long Room Hub, the college's Arts and Humanities Research Institute, was founded in 2006 and it takes its name with pride from the Long Room, from our library, which last year celebrated its tercentenary, its 300th year, because it is one of the aims, one of the missions of the Institute to help making the unique collections in manuscripts and in books and in other artifacts, maps of this library available. So overall, our Institute wants to increase interdisciplinary and interinstitutional collaboration, wants to showcase arts and humanities research, and wants to increase the accessibility of resources and contribute in a wider sense to public humanities. And of course, the digital humanities are absolutely central in this. We house a number of projects about which you will hear over the next 2 hours. And digital humanities is also one of the college's research themes. And we all welcome very much the opportunity to showcase the contribution that Ireland, the Trinity College, but also our partner institutions and many others in Ireland make to the digital humanities. And before I hand over, I want to thank, first of all, Jeffrey Rockwell in Alberta and his team for including us in this 24-hour Around the World Symposium. I want to thank the technicians who have made it possible that we contribute to this. And I want to thank our collaborators from other institutions here in Ireland, in particular Sandra Collins from the Digital Repository of Ireland from the Royal Irish Academy, and Katrina Crow from the National Archives of Ireland, and Mary Wallace, who is an analytics strategist from IBM, for coming here tonight to present together with colleagues who are centrally involved and are driving and spearheading our digital humanities projects here for using this opportunity. So my final thanks goes to Susan Schreibman and her team, our professor for digital humanities here in Trinity College, who is also the moderator of this program. So without further ado, Susan, I want to hand over to you and wish us all an exciting 2 hours with our audience here in Dublin and our audience worldwide. One rarely gets the opportunity to say that. So it's now for 2 years, it's Ireland in Dublin, and after that we will move, sorry? 2 hours. What did I say? 2 years. 2 years. No, that's megalomania. For 2 hours, it's Dublin, and after that, the symposium moves to Brazil. So, Susan.
Thank you. Maybe it just. So thank you, Jürgen. As Jürgen said, my name is Susan Treibman. I'm the Trinity Long Room Hub Associate Professor in Digital Humanities. And Jeffrey approached me. Thank you, Jeffrey, to let us participate in this. I'm going to just introduce the speakers, say how we're going to run the 2 hours, and then I will move off stage. So one of the things we wanted to do here was highlight what I think is fairly unique about Ireland, and that is the connections between the university sector, industry, and the cultural heritage sector. And the speakers today reflect that. And some of the things they're going to talk about, in fact, reflect those interrelationships. Not in the order that they're speaking, I think, I'm going to say this. One of the speakers is Sandra Collins. She's the director of the Digital Repository of Ireland, which is a project of the Royal Irish Academy. And she's going to speak about the DRI, the Digital Repository of Ireland. Owen Conlon is an assistant professor here at Trinity College Dublin and coordinator of Cultura, which is an FP7 project. He's in the School of Computer Science, and he's going to speak about personalization, user control, and a continuum of experience. Anthony Corns is the technology manager of the Discovery Program, which is an archaeological program here in Ireland, and he's going to speak about 3D Icons project, reimagining history, which is in fact one of the themes that we wanted to highlight here. Katrina Kroll from the National Archives of Ireland is head of special projects, and she is going to speak about social consequences of free access to the online census, 1901 and 1911. Jennifer Edmond is the Director of Strategic Projects in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Social Science, again here at Trinity College Dublin. Her talk is More Always Better? Sindari and the Challenge of the Hidden Great War Archive. And last but certainly not least is Mary Wallace, the analytics strategist at IBM, and she's going to talk about can big data analytics rewrite history. When we put this together, I asked people to maybe broadly but not exclusively talk about what we call here in Ireland the decade of commemoration. Not all the projects certainly have to do that, but Ireland is just into what we call this decade of commemoration from 1913 to 1923, starting with, in fact, the Dublin lockout and going through independence. And history has become center stage again. And one of the questions is, how can digital humanities participate and remediate that process? So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Jennifer Edmond, to Katrina Kroll, who is the first speaker.
Thank you, Susan. It's very nice to be here today, and hello to the rest of the world. I've never done anything like this before. It's very exciting. It's hard to believe there may be people out there actually listening to us, but I've every faith that there are. And it's lovely to be following on Canada, because Canada was where the Irish did their census digitization with the Library and Archives of Canada. Now, I am a technical infant compared to the very clever people you're going to hear from on the panel. I'm not somebody who knows a great deal about technology as such. What I am is a content provider and somebody who is passionate about providing free access to our cultural heritage in this country for all kinds of reasons. I want to talk to you today about the 1911 census in particular, which is relevant to our decade of commemorations because it's the last census that we have before this extraordinarily turbulent decade of change and violence take off. And we'll be talking further about that later on. Now, most people think archives are dusty, complicated, difficult documents which require professional training as a historian to understand, and some are. But most archives tell stories about people just like us who leave traces behind them in records, either deliberately or unintentionally. The census of 1911 is a prime example of an archival resource full of personal stories left to us to explore 100 years later and with meaning far beyond the intentions underlying its original creation. Censuses, as you know, are as old as human society. It's very useful for states to know how many people they rule, how to get taxes from them, how to persecute them, how to plan schools, transport and hospitals for them. For any government, whether benign or malevolent, this information is very useful, so they've been around for a long time. Ireland began to have proper countrywide censuses in 1821, and they proceeded at 10-yearly intervals after that. But due to cultural vandalism and bureaucratic stupidity, two curses of which we are still not free, we lost all of them from 1821 to 1891. So all that remains is 1901 and 1911, prior to our achievement of independence. So it was a no-brainer to digitise those census records when it became possible for us to do so. They were by far the most popular records we had, largely, of course, for genealogical research, for people researching their family history. The site, because it's free to access, has proved incredibly popular, reaching 15 million unique visitors since it was launched in 1907. Almost everyone is interested in their ancestors, of course, for reasons of self-aggrandizement or normal curiosity. And it has been very popular with genealogists, but not just with genealogists. Now, the free-to-access argument, when we put the census online, the country was swimming in fake money. That's all gone now. We're broke. It would not, I think, happen now in the same way, and that would be, I think, a terrible shame. One of the reasons why we in Ireland should stake out a special position for ourselves in terms of digitising our cultural heritage is that we have destroyed so much of it. In 1922, at the beginning of our Civil War, there was a fire and explosion in the Public Record Office, our then National Archives, in the forecourts, which destroyed 800 years of Irish history. Given that extraordinary event, which we did to ourselves, it wasn't done to us by anyone else, the least we can do now is to use the wonderful new tool, which is the internet, to make our cultural heritage available free to access. We also have a huge diaspora, 70 million strong, people who are forced to leave the country for various reasons, who also deserve to have access to this. Now, because the site is free, you can look up your own answers, but also everybody else's. You can gratify your vulgar curiosity about what the neighbours were up to, something we all like to do. You can look at whole streets and townlands, which are the basic units, and get a very vivid picture of what they were like. So it's a very interesting site to play around with, apart from the whole business of looking at ancestors, because you can search every possible aspect of it, religion, occupation, and so on. It is the most comprehensive free-to-access census website in the world. You can search by occupation, religion, nationality, etc. So you can find out how many Methodist butchers there were in Cork, our second city here in Ireland, how many French governesses worked in Dublin, how many Plymouth Brethren lived in Rathmines, and I happen to know there were 18 Plymouth Brethren in Rathmines in 1911 because I looked it up. So you have hours of harmless and instructive fun, all free to access, which is good for people's education. One of the most interesting side effects of the census going online has been, I think, a new attitude to ancestral poverty. The truth is that most Irish people come from fairly humble backgrounds originally, city dwellers from tenement houses, which didn't really vanish until the 1970s here in Dublin, and artisan dwellings, quite small houses, and rural dwellers from small labourers' cottages, where most people lived. By the Land Acts, which changed the ownership of land from landlord to tenant, sorted out ownership problems for rural families by accomplishing that transfer of land in a relatively short time at the beginning of the 20th century. Urban dwellers did not have that redress and remained living in slum conditions. Now, in 1911, the year we're looking at, Dublin had one of the worst slums in Europe. 26,000 families lived in tenement houses, 20,000 of them in single rooms. So that's families living in single room dwellings. Mortality rates were 22.3 per thousand. In London, they were just 15.6. TB, diphtheria, gastroenteritis, scarlet fever, cholera, and typhoid were all major killers. Child mortality was extremely high. Life was a real struggle for people in these conditions. Many were out of work, and the pawn shop and the pub were frequent haunts to raise money and to spend it. Women in particular had to bear the brunt of running households in drafty, high-ceilinged rooms where water for washing and cooking had to be carried daily, often up several flights of stairs. Sean O'Casey's three great plays, which many of you will know, give the flavour of how life was lived at that time in the deteriorated habitations of the aristocracy who had fled to London and elsewhere after the Act of Union in 1800. Many people were ashamed of having come from tenement houses. Upward social mobility, emigration, interclass marriage, and Ireland's dysfunctional relationship with poverty, which still exists, all had an effect on how people saw their past, and mostly the effect was to encourage amnesia. With the release of the census online, possibly in some part to do with our little moment of increased, if false, prosperity, curiosity overcame shame, and the descendants of tenement dwellers went in search of their forebears. And of course, they could never do this before, because people, working class people who lived in tenement houses, moved around all the time. And prior to us having a names index for the census, you had to know where they were, and nobody did know where they were. One of my colleagues told me that he wept when he found his great-grandmother in a house in Henrietta Street, one of the most beautiful streets in Dublin, but vastly overcrowded in 1911 with tenement houses. He had never been able to find her before because he didn't know where she lived. This experience was repeated countless times. Many people would talk to me after public events on the census and tell me stories about their families who lived in pretty awful conditions but survived and managed to rear their children, often losing many of them, as we see. Pride and survival skills began to replace shame due to poverty. The heroic qualities of people who lived through some of the most turbulent years in Irish history began to be apparent. The determination to build a mass trade union movement, much of it spearheaded by tenement dwellers, this begins in 1913, and it was carters, dockers and labourers, and later women employed in confectionery and textiles who did this. That began to be seen for what it was, an organised attempt by intelligent, desperate people fired by a passionate sense of injustice to improve life for themselves, their families and their communities. So the census is not responsible entirely for all this, but it brings these questions back into focus in a very personal way for people who are looking at their own family history. So we're going to look very quickly at what you can see in the census. Am I doing this the right way? Next. You know how stupid I am, Susan? Somebody help me with this. When I said I was a technical infant, I meant it. Use this one here. Great. Thank you. That is the census homepage for those of you who don't know it. It tells you what you can do. There's lots of very nice contextual material on the site as well, which I won't have time to go into. Anyway, we're going to look at Buckingham Street, which is a town or a street in Dublin City, which is still there today. And we can see by looking at this enumerator's abstract for the street, if you look at the very bottom of the page, you will see a couple of columns in the figure 499. That means 499 people were living in 16 houses, inhabited houses, in Buckingham Street at this time. And that gives you an idea of what the overcrowding was like. Next, we look at another wonderful form, which is the house and building return, that tells you what kind of dwellings there were on any street or in any townland, how many people lived in the house, how many rooms they occupied. We're looking at number 13, which is the major house on that form there. And we see that there are 9 families living in 10 rooms. And you get the name of the head of the family, you get the details of how many rooms they lived in, and in most cases it is one room, and you've got 5 people in one room, 3 people in one room, 9 people in one room, 10 people in 2 rooms, the aristocracy of the house, and so on. 49 people living in 9 rooms, and that again gives you an idea of how difficult this was. We're now moving on to the micro household, and this is the thing that fascinates everybody. You can go straight into somebody's household and straight into the middle of their lives. This is the Dixon family who live in number 13 Buckingham Street in 1911. George Dixon, married to his wife Marjorie, he's 53, she's 48. He's a bricklayer. They have 5 children, Joseph, Bessie, George, Julia and Kathleen, ranging in age from 24 down to 10. 3 of the children are employed, which is pretty good going for the period. The eldest son is a bricklayer. 2 daughters are laundresses, and they also have living with them at the very bottom of the page there, Thomas Power, a nurse child, a foster child, also sharing this single-room dwelling with this largely adult family. But the really scary piece of information here is when you look over towards the right-hand side of the page, you will see the child mortality figures for Marjorie Dixon. She was married for 28 years. She gave birth to 13 children, and only 6 of them have survived. So she lost 7 children of the 13 she gave birth to, which is really quite astonishing when you think about it. Now, this household and others like it challenge many of our modern ideas of privacy, first of all these people living in a single room. Comfort. Who got the seat by the fire? Because they would have been trying to find a nice seat in a large room by a very large fireplace. Sexuality, how do people manage to conduct their sex lives in any kind of privacy? Personal space, children today think if they don't have their own bedroom with a TV and possibly an ensuite bathroom that it's child abuse. Back then it would have been children head to foot on straw mattresses with a coat thrown over them. And it's lovely to be an old fogey and remind kids today that really they're very well off compared to how kids were then. But really the most serious thing is how to cope with the loss of children and siblings on such a large scale. How did people do that? How did parental affection work in those circumstances when a child could be snatched away by diphtheria or scarlet fever so suddenly? And it's very hard to know this from the inside. We can look at the raw figures here and it gives us some sense of what it must have been like. But to know from the inside, we have to rely on memoir and fiction, people like Noel Brown, Frank McCourt, Paul Smith, and of course drama in the case of Sean O'Casey, who tells us a lot. Next form, just very briefly, this is another household in the same building, the same number 13 Buckingham Street. This is Lucy McNamara, who has given birth to 9 children, of whom 7 survive. And we see a couple of names scratched out on the form. And these are the names of her 2 dead children, Bernard and Josephine. Bernard, 5 years old when he died, Josephine, 7 months old when she died. The enumerator, who was the local policeman, has callously put in the column beside their names, error dead. So that was his response to it. But Lucy was trying, I suppose, to give her children some kind of afterlife in the census form, and at least we know their names, which would be very difficult for all kinds of reasons to find out if we didn't have it there. There we are. Quick photograph of what the tenements of Dublin looked like. This is North Cumberland Street, and you can see these very gaunt houses rising behind. That's Tyrone Street, which is now Sean McDermott Street in the centre of the city, off our main street in the capital city. And you can see how gaunt and desperate they look, all of these people standing in front of it on a derelict site, some of them barefoot children. This is an interior from Francis Street in the Liberties area of the city, the oldest part of the city. Very unusual to have in working class interiors for anywhere in Europe at this period. These photographs were taken because 2 houses collapsed in Dublin in 1912, and there was a commission of inquiry for which these photographs were taken. So that gives you an idea of what that might have been like. There are 2 children in that picture, by the way, one by the door and one in the bed with her doll beside her. Now, that brief excursion we had gives us a flavour of what rich material for understanding human beings under pressure can be found in the census, and indeed in other archives too. It's impossible to contemplate these households without feeling compassion for and curiosity about their occupants. And this led one of our TV stations to commission a 4-part series called The Tenements in 2011, largely based on the census records. It was TV3, which is a relatively new TV station who had never done history programming before, and they were amazed to find that they got record audiences through the summer months when no one is meant to be watching any TV, 280,000 people a night. And this was one of the things that really opened up the discussion about tenement dwelling. It tried to recreate conditions in one of the tenement houses at the time, got a family who had actually lived in one of the tenement houses and had them live yet again in one of the worst winters we've ever had in that house for a few weeks to try to recreate what life would have been like. So suddenly everyone's talking about Dublin tenements. I was having my roof repaired at the time the show went out, and there were 3 lovely fellas working on it all from Dublin, and they were waiting for me on the morning after the first programme went out to say, you were on the telly last night talking about tenements. And I said, yeah. And they said, we were born in tenements, we grew up in tenements. And I said, cool. And they said, but we never talk about it. So I said, let's talk about it now. So we had a little workshop in my street about tenement dwelling. They went straight, zoomed off to their laptops to look up their ancestors on the census so they could know more. And they suddenly discovered that they, ordinary working class Dublin men, were experts on a subject that everyone was now interested in. So that was kind of fascinating to see. Archives can change social attitudes. The late Mary Raftery, one of our great journalists here in Ireland, used archives to change Irish attitudes about industrial schools and child sexual abuse, and directly influenced the establishment of a major commission of inquiry into the treatment of children under those circumstances. The discovery of files relating to the adoption of Irish children in America led to a national debate about identity rights, which resulted in a contact register for separated parents and children. And I'm hopeful that the 1911 census has changed people's attitudes towards poverty in the past, and that may change attitudes about poverty in the present. Perhaps I'm being a little bit Pollyanna-ish, but I live in hope. And last, just to give you a laugh, because archives can be funny too. Here's another tenement house, much better than the ones we've looked at. The Cullen family in Blessington Street in Dublin, a beautiful street still there with its Georgian houses. And it's Robert Cullen and his family. The very last entry there, scratched through by the enumerator, tells us that we have Tatters Cullen. His relationship to the head of the household is dog. They put in the family dog. He can't read, strangely. He's 3 years old and he was born in County Longford. So when people are filling out their census forms, please put in your pets as well so we can have a good laugh 100 years later. Thanks very much for your attention.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Jennifer Edmond, and I'm the coordinator of a large European-funded research infrastructure project called Sundari. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the major questions we've dealt with in Sundari, which I call the "Is more always better?" question, and the challenge of the hidden World War I archives. And there's a great sort of story in Ireland about the drunk who's looking for his keys. And of course, he's looking for it in the pool of light under the lamppost. And someone asks him, "Well, is that where you lost your keys?" And he says, "No, but this is where the light is." And we struggled a lot with this question of where the light is and where the light wouldn't be when we started Sundari, because we were charged with a mission to integrate digital archival resources. We were asked not to create new resources unless they were finding aids for things that might lay behind them. But merely to integrate what was already in existence and already there. But in thinking about that, we started looking at the level of digitization in particular within countries that would have been involved in the Great War, and realizing what a huge gap there was between, as it were, the digital haves and the digital have-nots. And this is this is data from the Europeana project, which you may or may not know, but it's a very large European digital library. And I think this is data from 2011, looking at the targets for 2015. And if you look at the numbers, you can see, for example, Estonia, Slovenia, and Sweden are all actually, at that point in time, relatively close to their goals for meeting the digitization levels they wanted to meet, leaving aside the question of whether or not this is just for Europeana or just for or reflecting the cultural heritage that's available generally. So they're all around the 77% mark. But if we then look at countries like the Czech Republic, Lithuania, and Romania, you see that the ratio of the cultural heritage already digitally available and the goals for 2015 were the huge gap. We're talking less than 10% already digitized. So what we were facing with this challenge to integrate digital archival material was whether or not we would actually take the letter of what we were asked to do, integrate what was there, which would mean a great presence from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, a great presence from the Imperial War Museum, and then swaths of information that historians were dying to have access to, which we simply could not represent. So this is when we came up with this idea of the hidden archive, and the question of how we could represent archives that were not already enjoying some kind of digital availability, that were not already somehow accessible at a distance. And we set the kind of the Sundari test, which should be that a historian could use our infrastructure and gain enough of an insight into records that were, say, in Romania or in some far-flung corner of the former Habsburg Empire, and know that those records were so relevant for them that they needed to plan to go there, or perhaps even needed to plan to learn the language of those archives. So this was for us a sort of gold standard, and a different sort of gold standard than I think was expected or than would necessarily be applied in other projects. The Sundari as a whole, and Sundari stands for the Collaborative European Digital Archival Infrastructure. First of all, we're aiming to pilot a research infrastructure, which means we'll have access as one of the goals, information coming in from the bottom, but also ways of searching that information in a way that helps the knowledge creation process. And then tools laid on top of that for both interrogating the data that a historian finds and also for creating personalized views of that data, personalized collections, but also annotations and other information that could be shared perhaps as a form of micro-publishing. And this integration was always hoped to be something that would become integral to the way historians would work. And we have two pilot areas. One is the First World War, and one is medieval European culture. So we're talking mostly about the first of those today. Now, going back to this question of the resource goals, there's several sets of goals that we have below this main mission. We have certain kind of technological watermarks we're looking to hit or watersheds we're looking to hit, and certain ones in terms of the networks. But in terms of the resources themselves, we really want to showcase these hidden archives and overcome the tendency to focus on those that are already well-developed, well-financed, and well-interrogated. So, and to do this, or by doing this, we will hope to be able to transcend the national and institutional silos. The word transnational history comes up a lot in what we do. And I was very relieved to find out that even historians are not entirely sure what transnational history is or what they mean when they talk about it. The best examples that we have so far seem to have a lot to do with looking at thematic approaches rather than strictly national approaches. But it's very difficult to do when things had different names, or collections may have been lost, or the comparability is somehow disturbed by the fate of, not necessarily even the people involved, but of the objects that were involved at the time. So one of the things that we're focusing on is where necessary, the creation or the support of finding aids, especially in these lesser known archives. Now, how's it going? Which is, of course, what you all want to know. It's a 48-month project, and we're about 16 months in. And we decided that what we would do first is try and just map the institutions. We figured if we could find the institutions, then we could try and go down to the next layer of the collections, and then where necessary, and this is more of an issue for the medievalists, to go down to the level of the items. So this directory phase is nearly complete, and the next thing we'll need to do is move into this prioritization, getting a greater granularity in the data. But even after 16 months, obviously there's always something you've learned. And one of the first lessons that we learned was that, unfortunately, many of the tools that we thought we would be able to plug in and have them meet some of the needs for this this harnessing of different silos to the same research cart. We found that wasn't working for various reasons. So, for example, we found a very good tool for describing the institutions, which then didn't have an export function. So, unfortunately, the tool itself, although we could use it to bring the descriptions of the various institutions together, we then couldn't use that to bring that information together with anything else. So there was a narrow scope envisioned, and we're actually working with the providers of that tool now to try and enhance that functionality. The second lesson was the lesson of data soup, which is a great phrase coined by one of my Sendari partners, Laurent Romary, where he was trying to describe the heterogeneous nature of the data that we would be bringing in. So not just finding aids from libraries and archives and museums, but also individual data sets that were being developed, ontologies, authority lists on the medieval side. So we have quite a bit of different kinds of data coming in. A historian makes sense of this very quickly because they know the data, they know how to use it, but we need to be able to organize those, some of them in the background, informing searches, for example, and some of them very much in the foreground, so as something that the historians can directly access in our urge to make a meal of our data soup. And the last thing is the cultures of conservatism. Part of that is, I think, coming from cultural heritage institutions who are seeing another approach yet another call on their limited resources. I think it's very difficult for libraries and archives to act strategically sometimes when there is limited funding available. And unfortunately, the European Commission would not let us hold money back to fund work in archives that were not already a part of the program. So we have to work within a structure where we have money held back to act almost as consultants, but we can't actually fund the archives to do what they need to do to make their own records accessible. And this can make the archives a little bit suspicious of us and wanting to know what we can give back. So we've had to give a lot of thought as to what we can do to the data, what we can do to the finding aids that institutions have to enhance them in order to create something that will then be of benefit to the owners of that data as well. So these are the lessons we've learned so far. I'm sure we have many, many more yet to go, but you can follow us on sendari.eu. So watch out. In another 2.5 years, we're hoping to have something that will be quite transformative.
Hello everybody, my name is Anthony Collins and thanks very much for Susan for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm going to talk now for the next 10 minutes on a EU project that we're involved in called 3D Icons. The 3D Icons project is a 3-year project. And looking at the recording of our tangible heritage or our cultural heritage in the form of monuments, artifacts and landscapes. Now, our tangible heritage, our monuments, artifacts, our landscape is a finite resource. As you can see here, examples from Bam in Iran, where the earthquake kind of decimated the state of the monument there, and human impact, such as in Afghanistan, where the Buddhas were basically blown up out of the hillsides there. These are a part of our history and past which we can never reclaim. And it's not so much in developing countries, but also at home here. We can see this is the font that was stolen recently within Ireland. It's been returned now, but we've noticed over the past couple of years there's been a lot of vandalism as well on archaeological sites. Up at Tara with the Lear Fall stone there was hit with a hammer. And we think somebody's going around the country basically taking samples off some of these sites as a fertility kind of a sample. Also it's not so much also the finite tangible heritage as it degrades and it gets destroyed. There's also the problem with access to a lot of these sites. So somewhere like Skellig Michael, it's a World Heritage Site. It has quite strict guidelines on what can and can't be done in terms of access. And somewhere like Skellig Michael, it's such dramatic in its shape, and you have to get a boat across that. If you're a disabled person, for you to get experience that's the way up, and they're not going to put a chairlift in or a lift. So for somebody who's disabled, they don't get to experience the idea of Skellig Michael or actually experience being there. But that also applies to able-bodied people. This is the orthostat, which is positioned in the mound of the hostages on Tara. If you go to Tara today, that's what you'll be greeted with. It's an iron bar grate with a padlock on it. If you want to get access to this stone, you have to be friends with the guy who's got the key. So again, there's no entry, and this is for able-bodied people. So across a range of sites in Ireland, such as Nath, if you ever got access inside the chamber, it's beautiful, but probably I'm the only person who's been in there, but it's kind of mind-blowing. But why shouldn't we be able to pass that on to the general public also and researchers? So 3D Icons, I come from a background of part of the job I do is digital documentation. So whenever we put a 3D Icons project together, it was part of this idea of recording and providing access to virtual representations. So it's 3D Icons. It's being funded by the European Commission's ICT Policy Support Programme, and it started the 1st of February 2012, and it's running for 3 years. And its relevance is towards architectural and archaeological monuments. So we're not age specific. So the French are recording the Pompidou Centre, and we're recording the Neolithic. So the whole range we're not being restrictive in terms of type. And this has been funded under Europeana, which was mentioned previously. So the idea is to create 3D models and a range of other materials such as images, text and videos that support this 3D content for a series of internationally important monuments and buildings. It's going to contribute to Europeana using, there's a previous Europeana project called Carrera, which developed an aggregation service to look at the metadata within Europeana. And finally, it's to develop this kind of pipeline from documentation to delivery of three-dimensional products and its associated objects. So these are the partners involved. I think there's 16 in total across the EU, and in Ireland we're one, and it's been run mostly by the Italians. I think there's 4 partners in Italy, but they've got some of the richest archaeology in Europe. So this is the pipeline that we're developing, and at this stage in the project, we're in between the capture and the modelling stage. So when we talk about capture, we're applying technologies such as terrestrial laser scanning, airborne laser scanning from helicopters, structure for motion photography, close-range laser scanning, a whole range of different three-dimensional capture methods. And these come at all different prices as well, so we're trying to look at the cost-effectiveness of these techniques. And then once we've captured the data, how do we model that into an object that can be used by the general public online without having to download an expensive viewer? Once those models are being built, they will then be put in a repository with associated metadata so people can find these three-dimensional models. And then the most important bit is how do we get people to use this data? So through Europeana, through providing 3D objects as educational objects, it's used within tourism, and it's also used within conservation and monitoring of archaeology. So this is a list of the sites we are doing or currently completing within Ireland. We've done about half of these so far. So some of these have been done using airborne techniques. Most of them, it's terrestrial laser scanning. So for somewhere like Knowth, we're actually recording the whole chamber tomb, but each individual curbstone as well, to different degrees of accuracy. So each monument will be recorded to at approximately 2 millimeters accuracy, and each curbstone will be recorded to about 50 microns. So we're going down to the microscopic level. So these are just some examples of some of the sites we've worked on. We've worked with these in conjunction with the OPW and the department, or the National Monument Service. So the first one there is Pool na Baron. So this is a 3D model. It's been surfaced now, and that was done as part of and maintenance as well, and monitoring, because they're worried about cracks forming in the kist. The second site there is in Gallerus down in Kerry. So this is what you're looking at there is a laser point. It's a three-dimensional model, but it doesn't have a surface at that point. It's just millions and millions of points in space. And there it's color-coded in terms of the reflection of the laser. As it hits the material, you get a different reflectance value. And the one at the bottom there is quite hard to see, but that's a cross-section through Loch Crew, one of the chambers there. So again, this is what you would see if you went inside Knowth. So it's about giving people access to these visual three-dimensional landscapes. The top one there is Stag Hill Fort in Kerry. To give you a background to how long the surveys take, traditionally if we were surveying something like Stag, to do a stone-by-stone record, it would have taken us probably 2 weeks to hand draw each individual stone. And by us drawing things, we've introduced things like subjectivity into surveys. That took 6 hours to do, and we have, I think, like 100 million points within that model, and it's to an accuracy of 2 millimeters. This here is Dunanga, so we did that a couple of weeks ago, again in about 2 days. So if you want to try and get rapid 3D replication of sites and have minimal impact in terms of tourists on site as well, it's a great tool. This is one of our biggest sites. It's the whole of Skellig Michael, where this was done using a helicopter and a laser. So as the helicopter flies over, it fires 3 laser beams down, and as the laser hits the surface, it bounces back. We can record the surface. And it does this at the speed of light. So just at the very top there, you can see the monastery. So traditionally, if you would never have recorded Skellig Michael like that, because you'd end up falling off the cliff. So we're going back there this summer to finish to do a laser scan survey similar to the previous ones of just the monastic site. So try and get different levels of granularity in the data. Again, this is another one of the biggest jobs we're doing. We're doing the whole of the walls of the city of Derry, Londonderry. This is going to take this. We've done half of it so far. This was done more of an opportunistic kind of addition to the project because of the City of Culture this year. on the 400th anniversary of the building of the walls. And I'll come back to this. So we have a community here who actually want to use the data and explore and experiment with the data and try to produce new products. So like I say, this is the whole data set for this, just in its point cloud form. I think it's about 2 terabytes. So whenever you're producing these kind of big data sets, you kind of have to have in your mind, and how do we archive this data? How do I provide access to a 2 terabyte data set to the general public? You can see that it also records graffiti as well, so for the historians. And we're not also recording landscapes and monuments, we're also recording the things inside the monuments, or the objects which were found at the monuments, so recontextualizing a lot of the things that sit inside in museums. So here you can see this is one of the curbstones in Tomb 14 in Nath. Again, you've probably never seen this stone. And traditionally, these would have been recorded by putting chalk on the stones and then taking a photograph of it, or pouring acetate or tracing paper over the stone and scribbling on it. And in terms of conservation practices, it's probably not the best for a 6,000-year-old stone. So what we do, we go in with different technology. And again, this probably took us about a day to record. And it's down to 50 microns, and we can start lighting the stone from different angles and bringing out different Neolithic art that you can't see with the human eye. That's the stone inside Tara's Mound of the Hostages, the orthostat. So what's the kind of eventual use for all this data is probably there's a couple of uses. Firstly, education. What we're producing is hopefully engaging data models that people like children and the general public kind of get. If I'm giving them a lecture and it's quite dry, or if I'm showing them a picture, they get the picture like that. So the idea is to provide educational projects or educational resources that can be reused. Access, again, some places here which are hard to visit, we can provide virtual reality or augmented reality. Economy, by doing these surveys, we've seen that it raises the publicity and awareness of a lot of these sites, and therefore more visitors, so we can kind of tie ourselves into the economic engine of tourism and cultural heritage. There's a sister project to this, it's called the Scottish 10 in historic Scotland, and they are doing 5 Scottish sites and 5 international sites. They laser scanned Mount Rushmore recently, or about 2 years ago. Just by them engaging in the act of scanning Mount Rushmore, they generated, I think, a GVA, or a gross value added, just by the publication or the publicity they received of about $1.5 million. So just by them going out to survey something, it gained the tourism value for Scotland. Conservation, because we're producing highly detailed surveys, we can go back and redo these scans and see how monuments are degrading, and that's the last bit is monitoring. And I just put that bit in about that's Moore Street, so we might be brought in to record Moore Street before it gets any kind of conservation. So some of the examples where what we want to do with a lot of this data is just give it away. So we've come to an agreement with the Derry data that we'd give it away for €1. So as long that we have to kind of fix some kind of license in there that people don't abuse the data. But if we give it away for €1, then it kind of makes the transaction transparent. And then we're here with Derry's the digital culture tech project in Derry, and have been funding artists in residence. So here they've been taking the 3-dimensional data and working it into a tourist app, so people can go around and produce augmented reality and see how the walls have actually changed from the siege era to during the Troubles. And then other examples we've been using is doing 3D printing. So these are Curzon stones on Inishmurray off the coast of Sligo, and we scan these because they're getting degraded. Traditionally, people used to rotate these and put curses on people. They'd sail out to the island and put curses on people, but because they're getting degraded so badly, they're now in a depot in the OPW. But what we did, we've scanned them, and now there's 3D copies put back on the island that people can maybe put a virtual curse on people. This is probably the most bizarre kind of use of the data we've seen so far. This is in Derry, where people are making chocolates out of the moulds. So they've retro or reverse engineered some of the heads, and then they've produced small molds, 3D printed, and then these are used for selling chocolate. So it's a total bizarre use of the data, but I think it's really good. And I just want to show an example here. This is of the kind of final models. This is another project we're involved in, but this is the kind of the final deliverables of the project. So this is a PDF document, which you can just, I think it's about 4 megabytes, and this is done in conjunction with the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies, and this is a 3-dimensional recording of an Ogham stone. So you can go online. Most people have got Adobe Acrobat, so we don't want people to have to download plugins or viewers. That's something that they've probably got already. And these like 3D objects that they can, explore themselves. And the idea is then because it's a PDF, we can embed video and also narrative into this. So if you want to see what the translation of the Ogham is, you can click on it and it'll bring up the text. So hopefully for each of the sites, eventually this will be the product that will be put online for people to use. So that's the website for the 3D Icons project and the Discovery Programme. This, not just my work, but also Rob and Gary at the Discovery Programme. They're the geosurveyors who've been capturing most of this data. So thank you very much.
So when people think of analytics, they don't often think of the humanities. And so I wanted to talk to you about our analytics experience with the humanities. And I wanted to start by telling you a story. Since it is a historical project, I figured we'd start with a bit of history. So in 2011, IBM released IBM Watson to huge aplomb in a competition called Jeopardy. And it's an artificial intelligence system capable of answering questions posed in natural language. And it was called Watson. So I thought, well, let's go back and see actually where it all came from. And actually, if we go back to 1949, we can trace IBM's history of its involvement with the humanities and with analytics, and particularly content analytics, back to Father Busa, the father of digital humanities. I'm not sure how many people are aware of the story, but in 1949, Father Busa wanted to build a concordance of the works of St. Thomas Aquinas. And that doesn't sound like a major thing now, but at the time it was a huge task. And he wanted to see, could these new strange things called computers, could they actually help? So very bravely, he schlepped himself over from Italy to the US and managed to get in to meet Thomas Watson, who's the founder of IBM. And he posed this challenge to Watson, which is essentially, he challenged IBM to build a computer that could analyze text. We take this for granted today, but at the time, Watson's response is, this is absolutely impossible, this cannot be done. And Father Busa, obviously a very smart chap, had seen IBM's slogan, which was, the difficult we do now, the impossible takes a little longer. And he handed that back to Watson and said, well, hang on a second, you just said to me, this is impossible, but you say the difficult we do now, the impossible takes a little longer. So, of course, he had Watson in a conundrum because he couldn't, say, well, we can't do this. So, sure enough, Watson was so impressed that for the next 30 years, he funded Father Busa's work. And during those 30 years, every generation of IBM computer Father Busa used that computer in his St. Thomas Aquinas work. It started with 1,800 tapes, so about 1.5 kilometers of tape, I think back in 72, down to 20 tapes, which is up to 65,000 pages, and eventually onto one disc. So then after 79, so for the last 30 years, then IBM has continued to work in this area of natural language processing. And then in 2001, we released IBM Watson. So I like to think that the humanities, although people, when they think of analytics, they think of science, they think of engineering. I like to think analytics is indeed the father of analytics as well for IBM. And in fact, actually, there's another really nice quote that Watson said to Father Busa, that he would fund it, but the only thing he had to make sure is that he didn't call it International Busa Machines. So anyway, that's the story of Father Busa and IBM. But anyway, in 2009, so 60 years later, a humanist again came to IBM and again challenged us to do something that was a little bit challenging. And this was Professor Jane Ohlmeyer, who's the professor of history at Trinity College Dublin. And she was leading a project that was going to digitize the 1641 depositions. So this is a collection of depositions that were taken back in the 1700s. And she basically wanted to not only to digitize the material, that wasn't enough, As with Father Bruce, it's just not enough to try and do the easy, it's the impossible. So she didn't want just to digitize it. She wanted to have an entire set of analytics and a whole new way of representing what was digitized. So she challenged us to look to not only analyzing all the content, but seeing how could we extract new facts, new relationships, how could we represent this digital content in a new way. And we call this the knowledge graph. So this is essentially the project that we started with TCD and IBM back in 2009. And this is where I refer to big data analytics. So, again, big data analytics is definitely not something you think about when you think about the humanities. But when we think about big data, clearly it's about big data. So it's about data that's high volume and high velocity. But it's also got two other V's, which is variety and veracity. And the digital humanities is definitely a domain that is huge, presents huge challenges in both the variety area and the veracity area. What do I mean by that? If we think about the variety of data in the humanities space, you have lots and lots of different types of data. You've got the structured data that we heard about earlier, census data, which is quite structured. You've got a lot of textual data, like the 1641 depositions. There's image data, audio. In the future, we'll have more and more video data. And the other thing that's really interesting about the humanities, which is very different than the type of analytics that we maybe do in the area of physics and mathematics, is in history, or specifically history, but humanities, is all about people. So every single piece of data that you have in some way connects to a human being. And that builds these really, really interesting people networks, which is hugely interesting for us today. You know, as we know with social media, it's all about people. So a lot of the work we do in the digital humanities is very, very relevant to what the business and the industry and the world is trying to do around things like social media. Albeit back here we were looking at 17th century social media as opposed to 21st century. The other thing about the humanities, which is a really great challenge for us in the technology space, is it's very distributed. You've got it distributed across different institutions, governments, you've different types of access. So this presents a great set of technology challenges. And obviously the different formats and also different languages, and not just the language as in English, French, or 17th century English versus modern English, but also different ways of describing problems, different ways of communicating. Artists maybe speak and use a different language than historians might use, than that might be used by a psychiatrist or psychologist or sociologist. Then the other question then is analysis. So the title of the speech was a bit tongue-in-cheek. I clearly don't think that big data analytics is going to rewrite history. But what it may do is uncover to the hidden history, that it may uncover history that isn't directly visible or isn't obvious to us. So the fact that one piece of content talks about Joe and another piece of content talks about Joe, are these the same Joe? Is there any correlation between these two events? This is kind of the type of stuff that analytics does really, really well, particularly when you've got lots of different types of data. And this really is the heart of what big data analytics tries to do. So we look at being able to integrate structured and unstructured data. So we might have a lot of text that's describing what people did. So we look at the 1641 depositions, and it describes where people were when these events happened, what they saw or didn't see, the locations they were in, who they were with. So this gives us some context. But then you have structured data. So you have maybe mapping data that gives you exact location. So you can see, did such and such person claim they were at X and they saw Y, but Y actually happened at some place 100 miles away, so clearly they couldn't have seen Y. So you can start to introduce structured data to find new insights and new analysis. So integrating structured and unstructured. And then the types of analytics that we have to do. A lot of it's content analytics. We do a lot of analytics around content, around audio, video, but also we look at things like statistical. You know, are we seeing, trends? Are we seeing correlations? You know, are we seeing things correlated? Is this telling us something? So this is, again, uncovering something new. And then the other part about veracity. When we think of veracity and big data, at least how I think of this is that you can't trust data. You can't trust it in the business world. You can't trust it anywhere, because sometimes you don't know the provenance of the data. You don't know whether it was created by a human being that had a specific agenda. You don't know if it's true. So inherently, the data that you're looking at in the humanities space, the truth has to be proven, and the truth gets proven by research. But maybe analytics can help validate and verify and prove some of the data that you guys are working with. So this is the reason why I think data analytics has a really interesting contribution to make to the humanities. Specifically, if I look at the 1641 Depositions Project, what we did here. Again, as I said, so, Jane Olmar wanted us to take the digital material and to look at it in a new way. So what we did is we took NLP, so back to our Father Busa and our IBM Watson, we took natural language processing to analyze this 17th century text and to extract a series of relationships. So by looking at what was said in the text, identifying, who is married to whom, who comes from where, what they saw, what happened to them, when did it happen to them. And from this we can build what our friends in Google refer to as the knowledge graph, which is essentially a large network that represents all the facts, but it connects all these facts. And many, many different data sources can contribute to that graph. So much the same way that Google uses this knowledge graph to create this new form of search and discovery, this is exactly what we wanted to be able to do with the 1641 deposition. So this involves analysing the depositions using a range of techniques, specifically using linguistic techniques, morphological analysis, syntactic analysis, looking at semantics around these objects, like is a place a place? Is it a city? Is it a town? Is it a townland? Is it a country? Extracting entities and relationships. Into this example here is Anne Booth from Drumully. Is she related to James Booth, and in what capacity? Integrating structured and unstructured data, because the key thing with analysis is semantic normalization. If we're building a network, we want to know that this Anne Booth is the same as that Anne Booth. This Drumully is the same as that Drumully. So this is where we needed to integrate things like structured data, names databases, mapping databases to show us how the townlands are structured, and then eventually populating this into a knowledge graph. Now, this sounds fairly straightforward, but I have to just show you an example of what we were actually dealing with 17th century English. And actually you're missing the bottom of it, but I have never, ever seen a piece of text that was so inconsistent in every dimension. For anybody that does content analysis, we rely on things like some sort of case indicators, because they tell us something about the text. Punctuation, it's nice to know when a sentence finished. It kind of tells you something. Spelling, to know that a dog is D-O-G and it's always D-O-G and that's a dog. Syntax of the sentence and semantics. In the case of the 1641 material, in the case of 17th century English, there was absolutely no consistencies. You had entire documents which had not one punctuation character. So you never knew when one sentence was rolling into the other. Case, in this example here, you actually do have some good examples of case for names, but you cannot rely on that. Casing for names was totally unreliable. And the language, as you can see, the spelling variations, 20, 30 variations of spellings for words. So this was, I do a lot of social media analysis, and we look at Twitter, and we think Twitter is ambiguous because you've only got 90 characters and people use this strange language. It's a walk in the park compared to analysing this stuff. So I think as a technology person, we learned a huge amount by doing this project. And the other thing that you just can't see, it's hidden on the slides, but the other wonderful part of this content was because it was transcribed, and to the example earlier where, they cross out things, as a transcribed piece of text, things were crossed out. There was things written in margins, there was things written between lines, which they kind of had to guess where in the sentence it actually belonged. So you also had all these markups inside the text, which made the analysis just hugely challenging, but hugely rewarding. So we did this project with our friends in Trinity, and so then what happened next? So I just want to finish by, for me, one of the most satisfying parts of this project was probably a number of things. One is we learned a huge amount. So from a learning perspective, I think, we learned a lot. Done a lot of work historically in doing things like law enforcement, the intelligence, which uses actually the same technologies that we used in the humanities space. But in this case, we felt it was historically relevant what we were doing. And maybe trying to capture a handbag snatcher isn't quite as exciting. The other really nice part is that this generated a real groundswell of interest afterwards. And a couple of projects, which one of them, Cultura, one of the guys from Trinity here is going to talk about later. But there was two projects that directly spun off as a result of our work. with Trinity. One was the University of Aberdeen. They did a project which was fascinating, which was looking at the language and the linguistic evidence of the 1641 depositions. So they looked at things like, as a woman, one of the things they looked at was really interesting, which is, as these were depositions that were taken by men, interviewing men and women, how were the depositions worded when there was a woman giving the deposition as opposed to a man? So if I remember correctly, there was a lot more language, like, the man saw something, it happened, it was very strong language, whereas the woman may have seen something or may have thought something. It's very interesting to see the way that they, even from a gender perspective, they analyze the language and see how it was different for different genders. They also looked at language to see the language of violence. How was these types of events described? What type of language was used? So that was a really interesting project. And then the Cultura project, which is a project that's still running now, and as I said, you'll hear more about that, which is a European Framework 7 project, so a European funded project. And what that was really trying to do is take the 1641 project to the next level and to open it up not just to the 17th century material, but bringing it to a broader set of digital material. One example being the 16th century illuminated manuscripts. I know that Owen is going to talk about the personalization piece. So for me, the thing that really I find fascinating with the Cultura is some of the analytics that they're going to be doing. They've done a lot of work around the NLP side of it, particularly with dealing with this noisy historical text, which has got very inconsistent language, as I described. Being able to analyze this text and properly normalize it is hugely challenging. So there's a lot of really great innovation going on in that area. And the other area is about the people piece, looking at things like influence analysis. Who are influencers? Who are both looking at the people networks from the context of the material. So who are the people mentioned in the material and how are they interacting? But also in the sense of the people, the researchers interacting with the material. So who is the aforementioned, the expert in a specific area of research? Who are they connected to? So maybe if you're interested in that area, this might be somebody you want to connect to. So looking at the people network is fascinating. And then obviously, once you have all this analysis, you can then do some really interesting personalization. So on that note, I just wanted to finish and really say that for any of my industry colleagues that are out there that have not yet had the opportunity to work with the humanists, I strongly recommend it. It's a nice change from dealing with, stuffy old physicists, and I'm a physicist, stuffy old physicists and mathematicians. So I would definitely strongly recommend reaching out to the humanists in your various institutions and trying to think of some interesting projects to do together. Thank you.
Hi, so thanks very much to Susan for the invitation to what's definitely a very innovative event and some fabulous speakers so far as well. So my name is Sandra Collins. I'm the Director of the Digital Repository of Ireland. I'm based in the Royal Irish Academy, and I'm going to take a few minutes now to tell you about really what we're doing in DRI and how we're trying to influence good data practice around the world. So what is DRI? So it's a trusted digital repository for the humanities and social sciences. What we're doing is we're building a national infrastructure. It's a big tech project, but we're informed by this very complex content that's the humanities stuff. So I'm one of the stuffy mathematicians that Marie was talking about as well in a previous life. And this has been a real eye-opener for me, the complexity and the challenges of the type of data that you deal with in the humanities and the social sciences. So what we're trying to do is to link and preserve this rich, complex data held by the Irish institutions and to provide internet access as open as possible and multimedia tools to allow you to visualize, to engage, to interrogate the data in the way that you want to provide it as openly as possible for the people, the students, the scholars, and basically to bring, this is public data, it's the nation's identity, and bring it to the nation for their use and pleasure. So one of the questions I get asked by humanities scholars is, well, what do you mean by data? You're thinking like a scientist. So this is a definition. When I tried to say what data is, it turned out to be a little more complex to answer than I had anticipated. This is the National Academy of Sciences definition of data. I guess really what I'm trying to do here is point out how complex this idea of data is. We talk a lot about big data and data analytics and so on, and I think there is an assumption that this refers to the natural sciences. I think that's not the case at all. I mean, we had a look at Anthony's data there. If you're talking about big data, audio-visual, 3D visualizations, this is really the future of big data. Now, what is digital preservation? So what we were about in DRI is about preserving this data. So digital preservation is not putting it on a memory disk and sticking that in your desk drawer, okay? So if I cleared out my desk drawer at home, I am fairly confident I would find some floppy disks and some WordPerfect documents and so on, and I have no way to access that digital content anymore. So preservation is a long-term commitment. It's active management. You have to be continuously monitoring your data and working with it to make sure that you avoid the digital black hole, digital obsolescence, the data that is the contemporary, the historical record being unavailable for future generations to access. So one of the questions Susan asked us to think about for the conference is, think about rereading and rewriting history. And what I was thinking was, well, digital preservation is really the opposite of rereading and rewriting history. So it's about preserving the provenance, preserve the data. But while it isn't rereading and rewriting, it is the thing that you need in order as scholars to reread and rewrite. So this is the service that allows you and future generations to have the data that you need to interpret history, social sciences, humanities, and so on. So some of the things that we would advocate in DRI for is just general, global, good data practice. So it's not specific to the humanities, but if we work as a community with these good practice ideals and principles and practices, we will benefit from them. So the first thing is digital preservation. So when you generate data, have in mind too, not everything should be preserved, not everything is appropriate or capable of being preserved, but have in mind too digital preservation of this data. One of the things is to have solid foundations for your data. So you don't want to build your applications, your visualizations, your use, your interpretation, your interrogation of the data. You don't want to build that on sand. So you need to have that data preserved. You need to have a proper way to cite it, and things like permanent identifiers that guarantee that in the future the reference to your data still exists. So people are used to citing academic publications, to citing analysis of data. We need the equivalent in practice for data sets and so on. And for that as well, we need recognition for the data scientists, the digital archivists, the people who generate, curate, manage and preserve the data as well. So we need things like the equivalent of the H-index, which the academic scholars, the scientists, scientific scholars would be used to using as a measure of how often your work is cited, as a measure of your impact. We need this for librarians, for data curators, data scientists and archivists who generate and mind and are the custodians and stewards of data that research is built upon. This needs to be considered in funding models. A lot of the humanities and social sciences, I guess predominantly a huge amount of it really, comes from public funding. And that's where we need to tackle. We need to see changes in public funding models to have these roles recognised and built into the costs of grants and so on, so that there is responsible data generation and preservation. Needs training, it needs a sustained infrastructure. You can talk about preservation, but without a sustained digital infrastructure to provide that preservation on the long term, you're making a short-term commitment. It's the opposite of preservation. We definitely need clarity on copyright, on IP, licensing, data protection in the case of human subjects, and confidentiality and privacy, and data protection. And if we need clarity, I would go far enough to say that we need reform as well, but let's at least have clarity to start with. Another thing that we advocate very strongly for is for open access. So it isn't always appropriate to have open access, certainly for government records and so on. It is with the goal of eventual open access, but understanding that it may not be appropriate in the short term. If you can't have open access, you should at least have open metadata and reuse of the metadata. So the record of the record should be publicly available if you can't release the data itself. But I think that this is a very important goal for publicly funded research to return that back to the public. So really what we're about is about changing policy, services and systems in order to change practice. Practice is really the hardest thing to change. So if we can tackle policy, services and systems, we can make that change in practice. So I had thought of telling you all about our digital infrastructure and the sort of systems and very complex stuff that we're building into that in order to provide the preservation, the access, the authentication, the authorization, all the very complex things that you need for a trusted digital repository. But in 10 minutes, I decided we might talk about policy instead. So one of the things that we're doing in the Digital Repository of Ireland is trying to affect policy. This is really hard to do. And this is how we set about it at a national level. So first of all, in wanting to have good data practice, the first thing is to understand what data you were talking about. So what data do the cultural institutions, the libraries and the academic institutions and the individual users have? So what are we trying to have good practice for? So we conducted a national programme of interviews with the data custodians, generators, users. That informed our national practice survey, which is our report. You can find it on the website. What we've done as well is set up a national steering committee, and we are working on national guidelines for good data practice, good metadata, good policies on access, on preservation and so on. And the last step in that, we can do all that, I'm really sure of it. The last step, but an absolutely critical one, is to have it adopted by the government as policy. This is definitely the hardest part, but our end goal. So let me show you some of the preliminary findings from our work. So national programme of surveys of what the cultural institutions, what does the National Library have, what does the National Archives have, what does Trinity Library have, and so on. Well, these are the formats that we found. And what we will do is to work with the community. So it's very easy to take a principled stance and say, well, preservation is JPEG 2000. But what we found is that what people have for images is predominantly TIFF and JPEG. We can't let that data not be preserved. So we take a very strong service orientation in DRI to preserve the data that is out there. Nobody will ever have the money to go back and re-digitize their collection. So we have to work with what we have. That's what we need to preserve. This is a snapshot of the metadata standards that we found across Ireland. It's predominantly Dublin Core, and you might think, well, okay, that's great, so you should work with Dublin Core, but of course that includes all the modifications on Dublin Core, so Dublin Core is it's not as simple as it sounds either. So I'll stop there. What we are doing is a programme of consultation with the community to bring value back to the community. I would really encourage people to come and have a look at the website and get involved, because in some ways it's a grassroots organisation. We're serving at a national level. We're funded as a 6 academic partner consortium, but the partnerships beyond our core partners, which is the Royal Irish Academy, Trinity, Maynooth, DIT, NUIG and NCAD, but the wider partnerships with the community is absolutely equally important. Thanks.
Turning where my slides.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Owen Conlon from the Knowledge and Data Engineering Group, and I coordinate the Cultura project, which Maria introduced earlier. And in that project, we're looking to personalize how users access these large volumes of content. So I'm going to talk a little bit about personalization and what actually that means. But I'm going to start off by talking about this notion of the continuum of experience. Because all of our users are actually quite different, but they might be on a path trying to learn and grow and establish a skill set. And in the Cultura project, we look at this kind of continuum, and this is analogous to what's looked at in Europeana for how content is accessed. And we look at general members of the public. Well, what skill sets do they have in terms of their knowledge of the content? So, for example, the 1641 depositions, and what do people actually know about Ireland at that period? And that will impact how you might introduce that material to those users. but also their use of the tools that are being offered. What kind of skills they have in using those tools, and how can we lead them gently into the richness of these tools. Moving forward, then, you have special interest groups, which would maybe have an interest in a particular local piece of history. So they might be specifically interested in County Wexford or County Kerry in Ireland, and they'd hone in on that material, or they'd have a particular interest in a particular historical character. Moving forward, then you've got apprentice researchers. So how do apprentice, MPhil, master students look at this material? What kind of skills are they trying to develop? And in that instance, we're moving beyond technical skills, necessarily domain skills, but to research skills. Develop the ability to critically analyze and observe that material, make notes around it, and add more intelligence into it, I suppose. And then also professional researchers and their own individual and potentially siloed interests in the material. How do they want to see it? So people are on this progression. So when it comes to personalization, we can't treat all users the same. And equally, treating them even as these stereotypes can be problematic, because people don't neatly fit into these little silos that we may be able to talk about. So how do we move forward from that? So let's think about some of the affordances that personalization offers. So what am I not talking about? So personalization is not about changing the color on the background. It's not about a page that pops up and says, "Hi, Owen." It's about something deeper, something that'll be in tune with your needs and will manipulate how you work with the content. But that offers a problem when it comes to research artifacts, because we've heard of this notion of the personalization bubble, and this is something that we need to overcome. So let's talk about some of the things that personalization should not do. It should not frustrate the user. So the user should not feel like chunks of the content are being hidden away from them and they can't access, they can't get at. So personalization maybe should sit on the side and offer guidance, but it shouldn't be driving the content. The user should be very much in control. And when it comes to the personalization bubble notion, it shouldn't hide information from the user. So what is this personalization bubble? You may or may not have heard of it, but this is the notion that based on information or the trails that you've left in your previous access of content, a system makes assumptions about what you need and what you should see, and therefore promotes certain material because of that perception. So a very simple example, even with no information about a user, if you do a search for great pubs and you're sitting in Ireland, it'll use the IP address of your location to suggest great pubs, probably in Dublin or possibly in the closest city to where you are. If you do the same search when you're in Alberta, well, it might suggest pubs in Dublin, but it'll probably suggest ones that are in Alberta. So in that sense, certain information is not being shown to you based on location. And that's, in a search context, well, that's probably appropriate. But in an exploration process where you're trying to develop these research skills, hiding certain information away and making assumptions about a user can be quite dangerous. So don't treat the user as a static variable in the system. That the user is in control. The user is a key component. In fact, the user is what it's all about. So personalization should help to alleviate cognitive overload. When initially presented with a new system, with a large volume of material, a large volume of new concepts, a user can be overwhelmed. They can struggle to knit that into their current cognitive constructs and actually understand what's going on. So it's to guide them gently, but not hide materials. So you end up with this balance that needs to be struck. As I mentioned, ease the adoption of the tools. If we're in an exploration environment, I'm going to mention Coursera, which is an explorative research environment. What tools are being offered on the side there, and how do you guide the user into usage of those tools? Because that in itself is a personalization process. And I think importantly, specifically when it comes to research, is to promote metacognition, for people to actively reflect on the steps and processes that they're performing so that they become better at those. They understand what worked for them, what didn't work for them, not independently almost of the content. You know, what worked when they performed this analysis. Personalization should also tailor the experience to each user's specific needs. This is a tricky balance. How do we understand those specific needs without doing explicit modeling, actually asking the user? And sometimes you do need to ask the user. It should evolve as the user evolves. If the user is on that continuum of experience, they're growing their ability to use the tools with their knowledge of the domain. So how do we ensure that we don't, I suppose, keep treating them as though they're simple, that they don't understand it, and that we actually allow the system to offer more and more control to that user. But importantly, in many of these situations, it should be non-invasive. The personalization should happen without hiding information, but happen without being too in the user's face. So it's a bit of a balance. So for me, there are four main elements that need to be considered when we look at personalization. First and foremost is the user. We need to understand the specific characteristics of that user, and how we gather that can be challenging. The second thing we need to consider is the content, and content is not strictly a simple thing. excuse me, content can be viewed as pieces of HTML, well-marked up metadata-driven pieces of content, but it could also be seen as services and tools that might be knitted together. And that's a kind of a complex situation where you're trying to bring tools in combination with content to make an offering to an individual user. Context is also key. In what situation are they using this? Not just the physical context of the devices they're using, but the context of is this part of a course of study that the user is performing, and how do we make sure that this is suitable for their needs? But overriding all of that is the need for some kind of strategic guidance. What is the strategy? Why are you personalizing? What are you trying to achieve to support the user? And we'll see that there may be multiple strategies that are being performed. So Marie kind of alluded to this, and she had a similar slide. One of the things that we can use is the information that the user leaves about themselves as they move through a large volume of content. So as a user steps through pieces of content, well, imagine what we saw from the presentation there. We had bits of text where we had the ability to uplift an entity, a person, a place, an event, a date. So in a paragraph or a sentence, we know that that information is there. So what if a user is viewing that? Well, we've maybe a low confidence they're interested in it. What if they annotate that specific paragraph mentioning that person? We can boost the system's understanding, the system's user model of that person. And we still have only a moderate confidence, but we now think that they might be interested in this thing. And if we keep seeing repeated patterns of them working with content around specific entities, that can grow our confidence in that model about the user. But that's only part of it. I mean, that's a very systemic thing, is the system implicitly modeling a user and thinking it knows all about that user. So one of the things we want to ensure in the Cultura project is that the user is also in control. So what we're developing in the Cultura project is this dynamic fusion of personalization, contextual adaptivity, but also social analysis, analyzing the social network within the content predicated on that entity uplift, but also the social network of the users, the researchers, how they are integrating, working, collaborating with each other. So I just want to finish with a couple of screenshots and a couple of lessons around the personalization. So this is a screenshot from the environment, and this user's been using the system for a short while, and I've honed in on a specific area, and this is a view of the user model. And you can see it's a very simple tag cloud, it's color-coded. It doesn't necessarily mean an awful lot to us because we don't know the nuances of this user. But these tags were pulled out of the engagement the user had with the content, what they highlighted, what they bookmarked, what they engaged with. But most importantly, this is not a static thing. The user can take any of these elements and remove them if they say, I'm no longer interested in that. They can add new elements and say, I'm interested in this too. Because the system will adapt and change to support that and offer on-the-side guidance. So first, a key element there is the user needs to have direct control over this type of model. Because certainly in a research context, one, it offers a reflective ability. A user looks at this type of model and realizes, oh, I didn't actually know that entity was cropping up that much in all the things I was looking at. Maybe that's something I want to pay attention to, or maybe it's something now I can explicitly ignore and push away. Here's another view of the environment. And first off, we want to remain very faithful to the artifact itself. So this is an authentic transcription in the middle, all the noise and misspelling and all the elements that Marie mentioned. Underneath that, we normalize, we modernize the words, we perform the entity uplift. We do all of these things to facilitate that, but we still remain faithful to the original artifact. And the personalizations I've mentioned, those based on that user model, are happening on the side here. They're highlighting the people. So you can see people mentioned on the right-hand side here. They weren't metadata entered by a human being. They're extracted out of the content. The location, similarly. The recommendations offered on the side are part of the personalization process to highlight items that are of relevance based on that user model that the user can actively control. So on-the-side guidance is important for this type of research. It doesn't take over. It sits there, makes recommendations. The other type of recommendations that we make are narratives, where we have this step-by-step guidance through a certain topic or theme, which the user can dip into and dip out of as they wish. They can still perform all the elements of free text search, normalized text search, look at the visualizations, work with the environment, and engage with the material, but not feel like they're being forced down a certain kind of peg and said, you are this type of user. So allow the user to grow and establish their abilities. So on that, I'd like to say thank you.
So thank you all very much. Those were fabulous, very diverse talks. And we have about a half hour to just have a conversation about some of the themes that came up. And I have a couple of questions that I thought I'd start with before turning over to the audience that's here, but also any of the audience on Twitter, which we'll be monitoring. So one of the things that struck me was that typically in digital humanities, particularly in the humanities scholarship, the affordances of DH is talked about most frequently in terms of access. Everyone says digital humanities is important because you can get these things 24/7. You don't have to go into the archive anymore. You can find these things. But a lot of the presentations here went way beyond access. And so I'd like to ask some of or all of the speakers, if you had to give an elevator pitch to a funding agency that highlights these aspects of digital humanities, not the access, but the affordances beyond it, what would it be? You're going to the 12th floor. That's how long you have for your elevator pitch. What would you say? Why should a funding agency give you, and many of the projects here talked about funding agencies have given you quite a bit of money, have given us quite a bit of money. But what would that pitch be? But you can't talk about access.
Okay, push the button. Essentially, so much of what we do in our lives now is to create knowledge using technology. If we're not using technology to create knowledge about history and culture, then we risk losing access to that knowledge at all. I only needed 3 floors.
Yeah, you didn't have to go to the 12th.
I'll pitch in there. I think knowledge is the key word there. Knowledge, not just in terms of human capital and humans generating and understanding knowledge around artifacts, but also what can be uplifted and extracted with machine processes. Because these layers allow us to distant read. And you talk about rereading history. Well, where do you focus in? If we have these large volumes of material digitized, where do you focus? And I think these extracted knowledge layers, they have their difficulties, they have their inaccuracies, but they can allow people to identify where to start and start to focus on what they're interested in, and maybe discover what they're interested in.
So maybe the 10th floor.
Preserve it. So I see some lovely projects about the commemorations and 1916 and so on, but let's not lose all that data that's being generated around that now, and the lovely narratives and stories. Preserve it, so when there's a next decade, the second decade of commemorations, we can look back on this. It'll be gone otherwise.
So I don't actually have to pitch to funding bodies. I have to pitch to executives. So for anybody that's in the industry sector out there, the argument that I've used in order to be able to spend time working with Trinity is really that, as I pointed out earlier, the problem that humanities, and specifically I have more experience with the area of history, the problem that they're trying to solve is about understanding people, understanding who they are, where they came from, how they feel, how they interact. And if we think about the future of the world, the internet, the social, we're becoming more removed from each other. We have to somehow humanize it. We have to understand each other better through electronic means. So for me, working with the humanities has really just helped me bootstrap. And when we were doing this 3, 4, 5 years ago, before social media was the big hot buzz that it is now. So it's allowed us to build the type of analytics that helps us understand social media, but doing it on historical material. So that's my pitch.
Anthony.
Yeah, I suppose it's the first component is gaining this knowledge and data, but that should just be the seed that inspires other people to do things with this data and knowledge. And like we ourselves try and embed ourselves in terms of tourism and cultural heritage, because we know that's a big economic driver in Ireland. And if we can try and get people to reuse our data, and places like the government to see that the value that is being passed down the chain, that brings back money back into research.
I'm afraid, Susan, I am an old-fashioned access girl, and I was listening very carefully to Jennifer on the whole business of lost and hidden archives. That is a pitch that needs to be made, because there's a lot of stuff that is falling behind really seriously now, because they will never, ever get funding themselves. It's just too difficult. But just an example of, I suppose, collaboration is one step up in terms of what you can do. We're very willing to share our data with other agencies that will use it to add value to it. And we're partners in the North Atlantic Population Project, which is run out of the University of Minnesota, where they're aggregating census data, both statistical and microdata, from the North Atlantic and many other regions, North America, Britain, France, ourselves, many of the European countries, so they can put the stuff into a comparative environment. And one of the things that afflicts Ireland is our sense of exceptionalism. We think that we're exceptional in all kinds of ways. It'd be interesting to find out whether we are or not when we compare ourselves with other countries in terms of how that data is used. So we're up for that. But I mean, I rely on colleagues here. Owen has been working with some of the data that we've got to add value to it. And it's very, very interesting work to watch that happening. I have great, great hopes for DRI in all kinds of ways, as both adding value, but of course, principally preserving material that's being lost all the time. So I wouldn't say that going to the 12th floor. Actually, I would say that going to the 12th floor is a luxury. Everything is a luxury until we're in a position where we can safeguard, first of all, born digital data that's in danger of destruction. That really is the key issue facing us all now. And secondly, trying to digitize material that is lost or difficult of access, that at the moment can't be seen by people. So access does remain the big issue. And then after that, it's gorgeous, and let's go for it and do all kinds of nice things. But unless we do that first, it is a bit of a luxury, I think.
So that brings me very nicely on to the second question that I had. And again, Ireland is, as maybe it's exceptional, but it is small, and it does make relationships quite easy. And even amongst the panelists, I think people who don't know much about digital humanities in Ireland would realize that there are real and meaningful collaborations between humanists, between digital humanists, computer scientists, whether in academia or in industry. And I wanted to ask members of the panel, how have these interactions changed the way that you view your field, your assumptions about your own research, your research practice, your methods, your goals by that interaction? Owen.
So in the Cultura project, Trinity is a double-headed partner. We've computer scientists like myself leading the project, but we are gifted to have really great historians working on the project as well here based in Trinity. Now, we also have European partners who are excellent. But I suppose from that perspective, working deeply and tightly with those partners, we've been able to see the noise of the world I have to work in. I did a lot of research previously in technology enhanced learning, where we apply similar technologies and personalization and so on, but the content is curated, it's beautiful, it's been bespokely developed for this purpose. Well, not so in the humanities. The content is raw. It has inaccuracies, noise, it has complex themes, and it's that complexity that really has forced me and my research to raise our game, to figure out how these tools that we promote can support researchers in doing the really hard work that they do. And also because the end goal is not always known, whereas in an education setting we often are thinking about, well, is it towards certain learning outcomes, learning objectives that they're trying to strive? What's the target for research? Well, that's something yet to be discovered in many cases. So we need environments and tools that are flexible and malleable to get to that unknown endpoint.
Great, thanks. Jennifer.
I would add actually not just humanists, digital humanists, and computer scientists, but also we do tend to work more than I've seen anywhere else with the cultural heritage institutions directly, and maybe that's in Dublin. I mean, they're right over there. Sorry, you can see me pointing. I think this level of collaboration, as somebody who was trained as a very traditional humanist scholar, having access to people whose area of knowledge is so different from mine, and I think vice versa, gives us as a group a kind of a fearlessness, because I know that at the edge of my knowledge is not this black this sort of black box of non-knowledge. I know that there's perhaps a space, but then there's a handover to another expert that I trust. So I think it gives us a chance to be very ambitious when we can really collaborate and respect the people's different ways of creating knowledge. So different from our own that we don't necessarily understand them, but we understand them enough to say, yes, this is an appropriate handover. Let's go bigger so that the whole research context incorporates us both.
With this whole experience has been kind of mind-blowing for me. So I'm a mathematician by training, and I've been hanging around technology for about 20 years. And coming to in the Digital Repository of Ireland, the cultural and social science domain, I found it absolutely fascinating and extremely challenging. And it's the most fun job I've ever had. I suppose really what we've tried to do with DRI is put ourselves in the middle of the different communities. So the data users, generators, custodians, and it's just been, I suppose, even in making a common language so that we understood what we were each saying to each other. So we'd say our stakeholders are the students and scholars, the academics, the cultural institutions, the library, the tech people. I'm really sure I've left somebody out there who's very cross with me right now. But even a common language. So we're charged with building a trusted digital repository. And one of our first conversations was, okay, so trust, what's that? So the social scientists, they had a priority there for, it's about confidentiality and privacy and being respectful of the data. And the humanities, well, it's the provenance of the data. The techies going, well, it's about security. And it's about, I said, oh man, this is really, really hard. But that's where I think all the opportunities and the great leaps in science are coming in the next decade. It's at the cross-disciplinary. It's where you bring the experiences from the different disciplines together and we enrich each other. I really do.
And I obviously have to agree. I'm a physicist by trade, and I work with a lot of mathematicians because in the big data analytics space, it tends to be a lot of scientific or very large number crunching projects. So for me, I think what I've learned and what's kind of changed me, and I think what's been so key, and which I totally agree that I think the real innovation is going to be on this connection between technology and the humanities, is that when I work in big data analytics projects, or when I work in analytics projects in general with scientists, mathematicians, it's all about the numbers, and they're very technology savvy, and so all the conversation is about the numbers and about very complex ways of representing those numbers. When we started working with the humanists, I remember Jane Molnar, she can hardly turn on her computer, so she was really, really not tech savvy at all, and it was wonderful because all of a sudden I had to completely rethink about how I spoke about analytics, what it was going to do, how it was going to be presented to an end user. And why this was so relevant and I think so important for all us technology companies is, again, coming back to the way the world is moving. When I was young, only scientists and technology people use computers. Now everybody's on technology, but not everybody cares about analytics. They don't care about math. So us as analysts, what we have to be thinking about all the time is how can we make our analytics relevant to people who couldn't give a toss about analytics. They just want us to tell them something interesting, how they can do something better in their business, how they can make a better business decision, how they can discover something from historical information. And I was forced, with a brick wall to do that when I started working with humanists. And now I'm being forced to do it because the business world is demanding it. But thankfully, we've had several years head start. So again, I think that for me is one of the greatest learning experiences.
I suppose for myself, the area of humanities I'm involved in archaeology is kind of intrinsically interdisciplinary. We're kind of schizophrenics in nature, that we don't know whether we're artists or scientists most of the time. And a great example of this is how it's changing the way we actually do our research. I was at a meeting in Bristol University there on Tuesday, where I was speaking to a geologist who was showing me isotope research and they've done on the gold in Ireland, and it turns out that most of the gold in the National Museum isn't actually from Ireland. So, and just how these kind of looking at a problem or a topic from 25 different perspectives just sheds a whole light on and a new light on how we judge things.
Again, I suppose I'd come back to collaboration, and again, speaking on behalf of the cultural heritage institutions, we're the people with huge amounts of content to offer. And I think we could certainly be doing a great deal more collaboration with each other, and that technology can help us with that it can provide platforms that allow us to connect with each other. But it has to happen on a large scale. We have to start looking at massive collaborations with each other, particularly around the whole area of born digital material, which is sinking into the abyss as we speak. And I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, I don't want this to be a gloomy day, but we are, like many other places, sitting on the edge of a major disaster in terms of what people are going to be looking for in 50 years' time. It simply won't be there. And perhaps, and one of the ways out of that, I think, is collaboration between various stakeholders, including government departments, record creators of different sorts, cultural institutions that are supposed to have custody of that, and technology that can help us find ways to be able not just to preserve this material, not just to make it accessible, but to use it in all kinds of interesting ways that will be of use to the general public and to scholars.
Thank you. I was going to see if anybody in the audience or on Twitter had any questions. Dermot.
So my question, I guess, is mainly how you approach it for Trina and maybe Sandra as well. In terms of, you're talking about preserving data and that you can't preserve everything. But how do you tell now what you might want in 50 years' time if you don't have a time machine? And who makes that call? And who do we phone up and give out to when they make the wrong call?
We'd be dead by then. There won't be any phone call to make. Anyway, phone calls will be gone out by then. Something else will be. We'll be communicating telepathically. It will all have been arranged by the analytics people that we can do that. It's a very good question. It's the job of archivists, traditionally, to make decisions about what's worth preserving and what isn't. But we've made some dreadful mistakes, and I'd be the first to admit it. I tend to be very conservative and to try to destroy as little as possible. And part, I suppose, of the advantage of born digital material is that you really don't have to destroy everything. It became a crucial issue with paper records when the big explosion in paper started to happen in government in the 1960s. Photocopying is a curse, actually, because it created this huge increase in paper records. But, for example, there are archivists, very respectable archivists in the world today, who think that case files should not be preserved. In other words, if they were asked about the 1911 census, to which, as you know, I am devoted, they would say there is no need whatever to keep the personal forms. They're not interesting. What's interesting is the administrative processes surrounding the process of taking the census, right? What decisions were made about that? What were the guidelines given to the enumerators? But throw away all the rest of it. Now, I mean, half the world would just scream with anger at that, quite rightly. We've become a society, or societies in different parts of the world, that want access to that kind of personal data from the past, and that it has become extremely useful, both for personal research and for scholarly research in different ways. So, I don't know. I mean, the email problem, you just look at it and think, oh my God, you know. At the same time, when you think of particular events that are of importance in this country, we had a beef tribunal sitting here for 10 years. It cost a fortune trying to establish whether there was government corruption in relation to our beef companies. If we had a single email from our Prime Minister at that time saying, I'll meet you tomorrow, Larry, to Larry Goodman, to discuss export credit insurance, it would have blown the whole thing to pieces. We didn't have it. we didn't have a note, but it was too early for that to have been there. But those kinds of emails can very well be there now, because of course emails have led to strangely a falling off in discretion. Where everyone was worried for a while that the whole business of FOI and all of that was going to make everyone talk on the telephone and not write anything down. People think emails are kind of private still. So you've got all kinds of wonderful official stuff being committed to the email system that wouldn't otherwise survive. But what's going to happen to them? And I don't have an answer to that question. My response to your question would be keep as much as you possibly can, because you don't know in 100 years' time what's going to be useful and what isn't to researchers.
And I feel like if you ask me a question, I can ask it back to you. Dermot is our tech expert in DRI. But yeah, I think this is the big thing. And so I was thinking in the last week about social media. So if you said social media is in some way the contemporary social record, that's what in 20 years' time people will think it's the equivalent of the Book of Kells or, you know, something like that. What do we do about that? Because you couldn't, I think Katrina is right, like the paper issue, that decides what you can, how much you can preserve. But there is also, you can't preserve all the born digital stuff either. So what are we going to do about social media? And I was trying to think, okay, we need strategies about what to preserve and ways of flagging what might be important. So even if you could preserve everything for a short while, you'll have to do some culling on social media over time. So can you use sentiment analysis, argument analysis? Can you inform what to keep through these sort of really fabulous, clever technical things we can do on the data? I guess what I was fixing my mind on with the social media is that maybe what we need to preserve are events and narratives around that you can't preserve everything, but maybe you can capture what are the important events. But yeah, I guess that somebody will be ringing somebody in the future to say, you did that wrong. That's not me.
Oh, sorry. So we had a couple of questions from Twitter. And one of them, in fact, the last one, I think you kind of answered, was, you know, how can you tell me now what to preserve for use in 50 years' time and how to preserve it? Maybe the how we haven't talked about much.
Yeah, so it's really complex. I mean, that's a big part of the research that we do in DRI is how to do that. And even the decisions that you make today are, that's preservation for now. And you just have to keep coming back to it again and again. So the goal is to be able to render that data in an authentic fashion at any stage in the future. And it's just, it's a massive challenge. So I can tell you what we can do now, but for 50 years' time, there has to be a commitment over the next 50 years to continue that process so that you can still access that data then.
Yeah, when I started working in the preservation space, we used the P word, that we were preserving things into perpetuity. And then I went to a conference at University of Virginia and I was disabused of this word. And we're not allowed to use the P word anymore. But I was told what we create is durable data, that is durable until we get to that next life cycle and migrate it into something else. So I always tell people to pick standards that everybody else has picked. Sandra mentioned some of them, TIFFs, JPEG 2000s. If everybody else is doing it, the community that I work in, TEI, there's going to be enough people in the world or enough people in your community who will want to migrate out of that into whatever the next thing is.
I think that's exactly right, Susan. And it also points towards, I know we're not talking about access anymore, but it points towards sharing with the community. The community is an incredible resource. So you have your paid resources and your engineers and your data scientists and your historians and the people that are dedicated to it. But the community itself is like, you can't do without that. And so sharing your data, sharing your processes and sharing your formats, your standards with that community so we can move together as a whole is the only way to go. Yeah, big time.
That's great. There was another question. This is a quickie. Will the 3D icons data be made open?
On the whole, we hope to make all of it open because there's, I think that in where I showed the old project, which is the Scottish 10, they've kind of locked their data down, and even Historic Scotland can't access their own data, having to buy it again. So I'm in the opinion it's being paid for by public money, so
should be open.
Yeah.
And I have one more question for the moment, but I think there might be some others. This is from James O'Sullivan. Is collaboration an essential element of digital humanities, or should humanities scholars become self-sufficient?
Well, I'll talk to that one. I think there's two forms or two views on maybe digital humanities. One is the cutting edge research element that we're performing at the moment, and the other one is maybe a more sustainable track. And if I draw the analogy back to education and look at the impact of technology in education, so many of our teachers now are digital natives. I mean, they grew up with all these technologies, so the teachers expect to be using these tools in classrooms, and all of the technology enhanced learning tools that were developed through the 90s have found their ways into these teachers' hands as tools they use in the classroom. I think we're on a curve like that in digital humanities. So tools, there's an expectation amongst this current crop of researchers to be using tools. We're developing those tools, and they're going to mature to the point where people are using them in their everyday research. So you'll have self-sustained humanities scholars, and they won't think of it as digital humanities, these are just the tools they use as part of it. But there'll still be that element of cutting-edge research that combine computer scientists, working with archives, working with humanities scholars to figure out what's the next generation of tool set that'll improve the capabilities. So it's a yes and no. I hope for this kind of sustainability and this self-ability to work with the tools, and then move forward and keep iterating and improving what we do.
So I just would add one point, and this is actually nothing to do with the humanities specifically, it's just in general the way the world is going. I think we're seeing collaboration as the only way anything is ever getting done, period. Because the reality is what's happening is people are getting more specifically targeted skills. So we see it everywhere. It's not, before we had computer science degrees, everybody was an engineer, or everybody was a scientist, and then they learned computers. And then it became very specific about computers. And now it's about data scientists. I'm sure in your area you get very specialist areas. So what's happening is in order to solve any single business problem, or any single problem, period, you're needing to collaborate with people that have niche skills. And I actually had this conversation on social media a couple of days ago with somebody challenged to say, I'm supposed to be jack of all trades. Nobody wants to be a jack of all trades, because a jack of all trades isn't a valuable resource. When you want to be an expert, and your greatest value is knowing who all the other experts are. And if you can bring the right set of experts together, you will beat the ass of anybody else out there. So my attitude is everybody should collaborate, period.
I have to say, Marie, coming from a traditional humanities background, I agree with you completely. And I think that people who think that, and this is a personal opinion, but people who think in this day and age that humanist scholars can be self-sufficient are simply ignoring the time frame of the way in which humanists collaborate. I mean, we have always used the knowledge generated by people before us. It's just usually after they're dead. The time step of the absorption of research and the presentation of research has been so long in the humanities. And one of the things I find hugely refreshing about working in a collaborative way is that I get to work with living, breathing colleagues that I know are at the cusp of what is known in their discipline now. So it's not that I'm using social anthropological theories that were developed, all of 30 years ago, which for me, when I was doing my PhD, was really cutting edge stuff. I'm using stuff now that was developed 3 days ago. And that means that I know that what I'm generating is going to be more relevant, more reusable, more open. And I think that we ignore those opportunities at our peril.
So we have 2 minutes left. We have time for maybe one more person to respond to this. Sandra.
No, I was putting it away. It's okay. I totally agree.
Anybody else?
I think one of the interesting things that's starting to happen, it's probably happening in other countries on a much greater scale, but in Ireland, certainly in the National Archives, we're now taking a very benign view of young humanities scholars who want to come in and digitize some of our material. Mm. And this again goes to Jennifer's concern about material that doesn't get out there. We would have a lot of material that might have very, very limited finding aids. And if we're going to get someone who comes in and says, I want to do a digital humanities PhD, I'm going to digitize this for you, turn it into a data set, we would say, please, may we have a copy of it? Please, can you do it on this platform so it's compatible with our material? We, of course, will keep it closed and quiet until you've fully exploited it, but it means that they're sharing back to us the fruits of their research, which in turn then can be, it's another form of collaboration, and a very useful one.
Yeah, and that's very much the way things are. Crowdsourcing is becoming increasingly relevant, not just in this area, but in every single area.
So I'm conscious we have, at least by my phone, 1 minute left. So it remains for me to thank the panel for a fabulous job, for wonderful presentations that I think really does show the variety of scholarship, digital humanities, and beyond scholarship, its associations, its collaborations, that collaboration between academe, the cultural heritage community, and industry, which I think really is something that we value very much here in Ireland. So please join me in thanking the panel once again. And I guess it's over to Canada to hand over to whomever's next in Brazil. Thank you very much.